He thought forcing her to sing would entertain the entire room. But in less than 10 seconds, Evelyn Carter was about to turn that laughter into something no one there would ever forget. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd really appreciate your support. Take a quick moment to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. It's completely free and helps us keep bringing you more powerful and emotional content. Also, I'd love to know where are you watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thanks so much for being here. Now back to Evelyn Carter. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Heights Hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers, every inch of the polished marble floor reflecting wealth, status, and carefully curated perfection. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in elegant evening gowns moved with practiced confidence, their laughter light but calculated, the kind that belonged to people who were used to being seen. But near the edge of the room, almost blending into the gold-trimmed walls, stood Evelyn Carter, her simple navy dress falling just below her knees, her shoes modest, her presence quiet enough to be overlooked but not invisible enough to escape judgment. She wasn't part of their world, and everyone could feel it, even if no one said it out loud at first, until one man decided to change that. Daniel Brooks, the event's charismatic host, known for his sharp humor and even sharper ego, scanned the room like a man searching for entertainment, his smile widening the moment his eyes landed on Evelyn. There it is, he thought. The perfect contrast, the perfect joke. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice booming through the speakers as conversation softened into curious murmurs. Tonight is about celebrating talent, about showcasing voices that deserve to be heard. And sometimes, he paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to build anticipation. Sometimes talent comes from the most unexpected places. A few guests chuckled, already sensing what was coming. Daniel stepped off the stage, his polished shoes echoing across the floor as he approached Evelyn, each step drawing more attention toward her. She felt the shift instantly, the subtle turn of heads, the weight of eyes measuring her, questioning her presence. But her expression didn't change. It never did. "Excuse me, Daniel," said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Would you be willing to join us for a little fun?" The room leaned in, a ripple of anticipation spreading. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze steady, unreadable. "I'm not a performer," she replied softly, her voice almost lost beneath the hum of the crowd. But Daniel only laughed, a short, dismissive sound that carried farther than it should have. "Oh, come on," he said, placing a microphone gently but deliberately into her hand. "We're all friends here, aren't we? Let's hear what you've got." A few people laughed openly now. Others exchanged knowing glances, phones slowly rising to capture what they expected to be an awkward moment. Someone whispered, "This should be good." The spotlight shifted, harsh and immediate, locking onto Evelyn as if the room itself had decided her role for her. The music cut completely, leaving behind a silence that wasn't kind. It was expectant, sharp, waiting for her to fail. And in that silence, something subtle happened, something no one noticed except the ones closest to her. Evelyn didn't shrink. She didn't fidget. She didn't plead or protest. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the microphone, her fingers steady, practiced in a way that didn't match the story they had already written about her. Daniel stepped back, confident, amused, certain he had just created the highlight of the evening. But Evelyn closed her eyes, just for a moment, and in that single breath, the energy in the room began to change, though no one could explain why. Not yet. The room did not breathe. It waited, suspended in a fragile stillness that stretched longer than anyone expected, longer than comfort allowed. And somewhere in the back, a glass shifted against polished wood with a soft, accidental clink that sounded far too loud in the silence. Daniel Brooks folded his arms with a confident smirk, already imagining the awkward stumble, the broken note, the polite laughter that would follow. He had seen this before. People like her rarely surprised rooms like this. But Evelyn Carter stood unmoving beneath the spotlight, her posture relaxed yet grounded, her shoulders steady, not tense like someone about to fail, but centered like someone who understood exactly where she was. And that alone began to unsettle a few people close enough to notice. A woman in a silver gown leaned toward her companion and whispered that something felt off, while a man near the stage slowly lowered his phone, uncertain why he suddenly felt like he should not be recording this moment. Evelyn's fingers adjusted slightly on the microphone, not fidgeting, not nervous, but precise, controlled, as if the object in her hand belonged there, as if it had always belonged there. And then she opened her eyes, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to meet the space in front of her with a quiet certainty that did not ask for permission. Daniel's smile faltered for half a second, so brief it could have been imagined. But it was there, a flicker of something unfamiliar, doubt, quickly buried beneath his practiced charm. "Go ahead," he said lightly, though his voice carried a sharper edge now. The crowd leaned in again, drawn by something they could not name, anticipation shifting into something heavier, more curious, more cautious. And then Evelyn took a breath, not a shallow breath pulled from nerves, but a deep, measured inhale that seemed to anchor her to the floor beneath her feet. The kind of breath that performers take before stepping into something far greater than themselves. Though no one in that room had yet realized what they were about to witness, her lips parted, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. A pause so precise it felt intentional, as if she was allowing the silence to settle completely, to make space for what was coming. And then the first note emerged, not loud, not forced, but clear, pure, and impossibly controlled. It did not rise gradually. It arrived fully formed, like a sound that had always existed and was simply waiting to be heard. The effect was immediate and absolute. Conversations that had lingered at the edges died instantly. Heads turned in perfect unison, and the very air in the room seemed to tighten around the sound. It was not just a voice, it was presence. Resonance that carried effortlessly across the vast ballroom, filling every corner without strain, without effort. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer differently, as if the light itself had been altered by the vibration. Daniel's expression froze mid-amusement, his eyes narrowing as his mind struggled to reconcile what he was hearing with the assumption he had made just moments ago. A server near the back stopped mid-step, tray suspended in the air, while a guest who had been reaching for her drink slowly lowered her hand, forgetting entirely what she had been doing. The note sustained with a control that suggested years, decades even, of mastery. And then it shifted, effortlessly, into the next phrase, richer, deeper, layered with emotion that did not beg for attention but commanded it without asking. A man near the front whispered that it could not be real, that no one like her could sound like that. But no one responded, because no one wanted to break whatever this was, whatever had just taken hold of the room. Evelyn did not move dramatically. She did not perform for them. She simply stood there and allowed the voice to exist, and that made it even more powerful, because it was not trying to impress. It was simply undeniable. And as the second line unfolded, something irreversible happened. The room was no longer watching her. They were listening, truly listening. And in that shift, everything Daniel thought he controlled slipped quietly out of his hands. The third line did not simply follow the second. It expanded, rising with a richness that seemed to press gently against every surface in the ballroom. And suddenly the space felt smaller, more intimate, as if the grand hall had been pulled inward and wrapped around her voice. Evelyn Carter remained still, her presence anchored, her expression calm, but her voice carried something deeper now, something lived in, something that could not be taught in a classroom or faked for applause. It moved through the room with quiet authority, drawing people in whether they wanted to be or not. A man near the center who had spent the evening boasting about his connections found himself lowering his gaze, unsure why his chest felt tight. A woman who had been smiling politely all night felt her eyes soften, her posture shifting as if she had forgotten to maintain her social mask. Even the staff along the edges of the room, trained to remain invisible, paused completely, their attention no longer on trays or timing, but on the sound unfolding before them. Daniel Brooks took a step back without realizing it, his hand brushing against the side of the stage as if he needed something to steady himself. This was not part of his plan, not even close. His mind raced to regain control, to frame what was happening as entertainment, as something he still owned, but the room no longer belonged to him. Not in this moment. Evelyn's voice transitioned again, effortlessly, into a higher register that did not strain or falter, but opened like a window into something vast and precise. The clarity of it made several people inhale sharply, not out of shock alone, but out of recognition. Because somewhere deep down, they understood that what they were hearing was rare, something they could not categorize or dismiss. A man in the front row who had attended countless performances in New York sat forward slowly, his brows tightening as he tried to place the technique, the control, the emotional restraint paired with power. It did not make sense, not coming from her, not from someone they had already decided was ordinary, and that realization unsettled them more than anything else, because it meant they had been wrong, completely wrong. Evelyn did not look at them. She did not seek their approval or their validation. Her eyes remained steady, focused somewhere beyond the crowd, as if the performance was not for them at all, and that only deepened the impact, because it stripped away the expectation of pleasing them, leaving only the truth of what she could do. The music rose again, this time carrying a subtle complexity that revealed itself in layers, each note placed with intention, each phrase connected with a discipline that spoke of years of unseen work, of quiet repetition, of a life lived far from stages like this, and yet fully deserving of them. A woman near the back felt a tear form unexpectedly, brushing it away quickly as if embarrassed by her own reaction. But she was not alone. Across the room, expressions had shifted from amusement to something closer to reverence. Daniel's smile was gone now, replaced by a tight stillness, his earlier confidence dissolving into something he could not easily hide. He glanced around, searching for laughter, for agreement, for any sign that he could still control the narrative. But there was none, only silence and attention. And in that silence, Evelyn reached a moment that could have broken lesser performers, a delicate transition that required absolute precision. And without hesitation, she moved through it flawlessly, the sound carrying a quiet intensity that held the room completely still. No movement, no whispers, just listening, pure and uninterrupted. And in that moment, the truth settled over everyone present. This was not a mistake. This was not luck. This was mastery, undeniable and fully revealed. And yet Evelyn gave no sign that she cared whether they understood it or not. She simply continued, as if this had always been inevitable, and then it happened. The moment where everything shifted from admiration into something far deeper, something irreversible. Evelyn Carter's voice did not just continue, it transformed, rising into a passage so controlled, so emotionally precise, that it felt as though the air itself had aligned around her, each note landing exactly where it needed to, not a fraction too early, not a fraction too late. And for the first time that evening, no one in that room was thinking about her appearance, her dress, or why she had been chosen. They were thinking about only one thing: how someone like her could hold a room like this without effort. Daniel Brooks felt it most clearly, the loss of control, the complete unraveling of the moment he had engineered. He shifted his weight again, this time more noticeably, his jaw tightening as he glanced toward the audience, searching for distraction, for movement, for anything that could pull attention away from her. But there was nothing, no whispers, no laughter, not even the subtle sounds of shifting chairs or clinking glasses. The room had surrendered entirely to her voice, and that realization pressed against him, harder than any embarrassment ever could. Near the front, a woman who had spent years attending elite performances leaned forward with a quiet intensity, her expression no longer polite but deeply focused, as if she were studying something rare, something she might never witness again, while a man beside her slowly removed his glasses, not because he needed to, but because he needed to see this more clearly, to make sure it was real. Evelyn moved into the next phrase with a softness that contrasted everything that had come before, a controlled descent that revealed even greater mastery, because restraint like that could not be improvised. It could only come from discipline, from experience, from countless unseen hours. And that was when the realization began to spread, not in words, but in the way people held themselves, in the way their posture shifted, in the way their eyes remained fixed on her. Without blinking, she was not an accident. She was not a surprise. She was something they had failed to recognize, and that failure now hung quietly in the space between them, heavier than any spoken apology. Daniel swallowed, the sound almost audible in the silence. His confidence had not just cracked, it had dissolved, leaving behind a man who no longer understood his place in the moment. He had wanted a spectacle, something light, something disposable, but what he had created instead was something far beyond him, something that exposed not just his misjudgment, but the assumptions of everyone in that room. Evelyn's voice rose again, this time fuller, carrying a resonance that seemed to echo long after each note ended, as if the room itself refused to let the sound go. A server near the back blinked slowly, realizing she had not moved in over a minute, her tray still balanced perfectly in her hands, forgotten, while another guest, who had been recording earlier, slowly lowered his phone completely, understanding now that this was not something to capture casually. This was something to witness. And then came the final phrase, not loud, not dramatic, but delivered with a quiet certainty that held more power than anything before it. Evelyn allowed the note to linger just long enough, just enough to let it settle into every corner of the room, before releasing it with a control so precise it felt intentional down to the smallest detail. And then silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was not expectant or sharp. It was full, heavy with realization, with awe, with something that bordered on disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The room remained frozen, as if breaking the moment would somehow undo what they had just experienced. And at the center of it all, Evelyn Carter lowered the microphone slightly, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. And that was the most unsettling part of all, because for her, it had not been extraordinary. It had simply been truth finally allowed to be heard. No one moved. Not at first. The silence after her final note stretched across the ballroom like something sacred, something no one dared to interrupt. And for a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had paused to acknowledge what had just happened. Evelyn Carter stood at the center of it all, the microphone still in her hand, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, untouched by the magnitude of what she had just revealed. And that calm unsettled them even more than her voice had, because it meant she had never doubted herself. Not for a second. Somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, as if asking permission. Then another followed, and another, until the entire room erupted into applause. Not the polite, measured applause of a formal event, but something louder, more urgent, something closer to recognition than admiration. People rose from their seats almost instinctively, drawn to their feet by a force they could not quite explain. The same people who had laughed moments earlier now clapped the hardest, their faces flushed with something between awe and quiet embarrassment. Daniel Brooks did not clap, not immediately. He stood frozen, his mind still trying to catch up to the reality unfolding in front of him. His role in all of this suddenly clear in a way he could not ignore. He had not discovered talent. He had exposed his own assumptions, and the weight of that realization pressed heavily against him. Finally, almost mechanically, he brought his hands together, the sound of his applause hollow compared to the rest, his earlier confidence replaced by something far less comfortable, humility. Though he did not yet know how to carry it, Evelyn slowly lowered the microphone, her gaze drifting briefly across the crowd, not searching for approval, not measuring their reaction, simply acknowledging that the moment was complete. And then, without a word, she turned slightly, as if the performance had ended long before they realized it had begun. A man near the stage leaned toward his companion, his voice barely above a whisper, asking who she was, but no one had an answer, because no one had thought to ask before. A woman in the front row pressed her hand gently against her chest, as if steadying her breath, her eyes still fixed on Evelyn with a kind of quiet reverence. The applause continued, growing, echoing against the high ceilings, filling the space that her voice had just transformed, but Evelyn did not bask in it. She did not bow. She did not step forward to claim it. Instead, she placed the microphone back into its stand with careful precision, a small, deliberate motion that carried more weight than any grand gesture could have. And then she stepped away from the spotlight, each step unhurried, unremarkable, and yet impossible to ignore. The crowd parted slightly without being asked, creating a path that had not existed before, not because she demanded it, but because something about her presence now required it. Daniel watched her go, his expression tight, conflicted, as if he wanted to say something, to reclaim some part of the moment. But the words did not come, because there was nothing he could say that would restore what he had already lost: control, certainty, the illusion of superiority. All of it had slipped away the moment she opened her mouth, and now all that remained was the quiet truth standing in front of him. Evelyn Carter reached the edge of the room, the light from the chandeliers softening as she moved away from the center, and for a brief second, she paused, not for the crowd, not for the applause, but as if acknowledging something only she understood, and then she continued walking, disappearing into the same space where she had once been overlooked, leaving behind a room full of people who would never see someone like her the same way again. And yet, even as the applause slowly began to fade, one question lingered in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. If that was only her voice, then what else had they failed to see all along? The applause followed her longer than expected, echoing faintly even as Evelyn Carter stepped beyond the grand doors of the ballroom and into the quiet hallway beyond, where the noise softened into a distant murmur and the polished marble gave way to a calmer, more ordinary space, the kind of place no one noticed because nothing extraordinary was supposed to happen there. And yet that was exactly where she seemed most at home, her steps steady, unhurried, as if the weight of the room she had just transformed had never touched her at all. Behind her, inside the ballroom, the energy refused to settle. Conversations broke out in overlapping waves, voices low but urgent, each person trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. A man near the stage insisted she must have been professionally trained, while another argued that no performance he had attended in New York or Los Angeles had ever felt quite like that. A woman quietly asked if anyone knew her name, and when no one answered immediately, the question lingered, heavier than before, because now it mattered. Daniel Brooks remained near the center of the room, no longer the focal point, but unable to leave, his eyes fixed on the doorway where Evelyn had disappeared. His expression caught between disbelief and something far more uncomfortable, recognition. He replayed the moment in his mind, the way he had chosen her, the ease with which he had assumed her role, the certainty that the room would follow his lead. And now that certainty felt fragile, almost embarrassing. He adjusted his jacket slowly, as if trying to restore some sense of control, but the room no longer responded to him the way it had before. People were not looking at him anymore. They were looking past him, through him, searching for something else, something real. Across the ballroom, a woman in a deep green gown approached one of the event organizers, her voice calm but firm as she asked who had invited Evelyn Carter. The organizer hesitated, flipping through a digital guest list that suddenly felt incomplete. Her name was not there, not among the donors, not among the performers, not even among the extended guests, and that absence created a ripple of confusion. Because if she did not belong on paper, then how had she commanded the room so completely? A quiet realization began to settle among a few of the more perceptive guests. Perhaps belonging had never been about invitation at all. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Evelyn paused briefly near a large window overlooking the city lights, the glow reflecting softly against the glass, her reflection faint but steady. She did not smile. She did not sigh with relief. She simply stood there for a moment, her breathing even, as if she had returned to a familiar rhythm. Footsteps approached from behind, hesitant at first, then more certain. A young woman from the event staff, still holding a folded linen napkin in her hands, stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to speak. Finally, she gathered the courage, her voice quiet but sincere as she said that what Evelyn had done in that room had changed something. Not just the event, but the way people were looking at each other. Evelyn turned slightly, meeting her eyes with a calm warmth that did not seek recognition but acknowledged it. She thanked her softly. Nothing more, no explanation, no story offered. And that simplicity carried its own weight, because it left space for the truth to exist without being defined. Back inside, Daniel took a step toward the stage again, as if considering whether to regain his role, to speak, to redirect the evening. But he stopped halfway, realizing that whatever he said now would only sound smaller than what had already been heard. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, he chose silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood that not every moment was his to control. And as the night continued, the conversations shifted, softer, more thoughtful, as if the room itself had been recalibrated. And though Evelyn Carter was no longer there, her presence remained, not in the spotlight, but in the way people now hesitated. Before judging, in the way they looked twice instead of once. And in that quiet shift, something far more lasting than applause began to take hold. The hallway returned to its quiet rhythm. But something had changed in the way the air itself seemed to settle, as if the echo of Evelyn Carter's voice had followed her beyond the ballroom and refused to fade completely. She stood by the window for a moment longer, the city lights stretching out in soft lines beneath the night sky, distant traffic, moving like a quiet current far below. And for the first time since she stepped onto that stage, there was no audience, no expectation, just stillness, the kind she understood. Behind her, the door to the ballroom opened again, not loudly, but enough to let a slice of light spill into the hallway, followed by footsteps that were more deliberate this time. Daniel Brooks stepped through, pausing just inside the doorway as if uncertain whether he should continue, the confidence that once defined his movements now replaced by hesitation. He watched her for a second before speaking, his voice quieter than it had been all evening, stripped of its performance. "That was not what I expected," he said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything he had misjudged. Evelyn turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge him without giving the moment more than it needed. "Expectations tend to say more about the person holding them," she replied calmly, her tone even, not defensive, not proud, just honest. Daniel let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without amusement. "That may be the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in years," he admitted, stepping a little closer, but still keeping a respectful distance. "I thought I understood how rooms worked, how people respond, what they want to see." He paused, searching for the right words. "But tonight, I realized I was only seeing what I expected to see, not what was actually there." Evelyn's gaze softened slightly, not in sympathy, but in recognition of something genuine. "Most people do," she said, turning her attention back toward the window. "It is easier that way." Daniel followed her line of sight, looking out at the city, his reflection faint in the glass beside hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer uncomfortable, but thoughtful. He finally broke it. "Who are you?" he asked, not with authority, not with entitlement, but with something closer to curiosity, real curiosity, the kind that listens. Evelyn did not answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the sleeve of her dress slightly, a small, grounding motion. Then she spoke. "I am someone who spent a long time learning how to be invisible in rooms like that," she said, her voice steady. "And even longer learning when not to be." Daniel absorbed that, the simplicity of it, the depth behind it, and he nodded slowly, as if something inside him had shifted into place. Back in the ballroom, the energy continued to evolve, conversations quieter now, more reflective. A few guests had already begun searching online, typing fragments of what they had witnessed, trying to find a name, a video, any trace that could confirm what they had experienced. But nothing immediate appeared, no familiar clips, no recognizable profile, only the unsettling possibility that they had encountered something real, something not packaged or promoted. And that realization lingered longer than any headline could have. In the hallway, Daniel straightened slightly, not to reclaim his previous confidence, but to carry himself differently, more aware. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "not for inviting you, but for why I did it." Evelyn looked at him then, fully this time, her expression unchanged but her attention complete. "Apologies are only useful if they change something," she replied, her words quiet but clear. Daniel nodded again, understanding that this was not a moment for dramatic gestures, but for something simpler, more difficult, consistency. "I think they already have," he said, glancing back toward the ballroom, where the sound of conversation drifted faintly through the open door. Evelyn followed his gaze for a brief second, then turned away, her path already set, as she began to walk down the hallway. Daniel did not stop her, did not call after her, because for the first time, he understood that not every story needed to be held. Some simply needed to be witnessed. And as Evelyn Carter disappeared around the corner, leaving behind nothing but the quiet echo of what had been revealed, the truth settled gently but firmly into the space she left behind. That the most powerful voices are not the ones that demand attention, but the ones that never needed it in the first Place the corner she turned past did not echo her presence. It absorbed it, as if Evelyn Carter had stepped back into a world that no longer needed to announce itself. The hallway dimmed slightly as she moved farther from the ballroom, the distant hum of conversation fading into something indistinct. And yet behind those closed doors, her absence was louder than any applause had been. Inside, the room had not returned to normal. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted, the kind of shift that does not reverse once it settles in. A group of guests gathered near the stage spoke in low, measured tones, no longer competing for attention, but searching for clarity. One man insisted she must have trained at a world-class conservatory, listing names with confidence, but another shook his head slowly, pointing out that none of those performers carried themselves the way she did. Not with that level of detachment from recognition, not with that quiet certainty. Nearby, a woman, who had initially laughed when Evelyn was called forward, now sat still, her hands folded in her lap, replaying the moment over and over, not the performance itself, but her own reaction to it, the way she had judged before hearing a single note. And that realization lingered heavier than anything else. Across the room, phones lit up as guests searched again, typing fragments, descriptions, anything that might lead them to a name, a recording, a trace, but the results remained scattered, inconclusive, as if Evelyn Carter existed just outside the systems they relied on to define importance, and that absence began to feel intentional, as if she had never needed to be found in order to be real. Daniel Brooks stood near the edge of the stage, no longer at its center. Watching the room with a perspective he had never held before, he noticed the pauses in conversation, the hesitations, the second glances people gave one another, and he understood that the performance had not just revealed her, it had revealed them, their habits, their assumptions, their reflex to categorize before understanding. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering as something within him settled into a quieter awareness, not defeat, but adjustment, a recognition that control had limits, and that some moments demanded something else entirely, respect earned without invitation. In a far corner, the event organizer finally stopped scrolling through the guest list, her expression thoughtful as she closed the tablet, realizing that the question of how Evelyn had entered the room was no longer the most important one. The more pressing question was why no one had noticed her until she was placed under a spotlight, and what that said about everyone present. The music resumed softly in the background, but it did not carry the same energy. It was no longer the focus, just a backdrop to a room that had become more aware of itself. Conversations shifted from status and introductions to something more grounded, more reflective. A few guests even approached the staff with a different tone, more patient, more attentive, as if something subtle but meaningful had been recalibrated. Outside, the night air greeted Evelyn as she stepped through the final exit, the city stretching out before her in quiet indifference. Cars passing, lights flickering, life continuing without spectacle. She paused briefly on the steps, not to reflect on what had happened, but simply to adjust to the cooler air, her breath steady, her presence unchanged, as if the room she had left behind had been just another moment in a much longer journey. A black sedan passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across the pavement before disappearing into the distance, and for a brief second, the world felt vast again, open, uncontained. Inside, Daniel finally stepped away from the stage completely, blending back into the crowd, no longer directing it, but observing it, and as he did, he caught fragments of conversation that echoed the same realization in different words, that they had all seen something real, something unfiltered, and that it had challenged more than just their expectations, it had challenged their perspective, and in that quiet shift, the evening transformed from an event into a moment that would stay with them long after the lights dimmed. Because somewhere between the laughter that started it and the silence that followed, they had been reminded of something simple, something easy to forget, that what people choose to show the world is not always what defines them, and what they hide may hold far more power than anyone expects. The night carried on beyond the glass doors of the Sterling Heights Hotel, but for those who had been inside that ballroom, something had quietly refused to move on with it. Evelyn Carter stepped onto the sidewalk and into the rhythm of the city, her figure blending effortlessly into the passing flow of ordinary life. No spotlight, no applause, just the distant hum of traffic and the soft glow of streetlights stretching down the block. She adjusted her sleeve once more, a small, habitual motion, and continued walking as if nothing had happened. As if the room she had just transformed was only a brief pause in a much larger story no one there had been invited to see. Behind her, inside the ballroom, the conversations had softened into something more thoughtful, more measured. People no longer spoke to impress. They spoke to understand. A subtle but undeniable shift. Daniel Brooks stood near a tall window now, watching the city beyond, his reflection faint against the glass. The confidence that once defined him had not disappeared, but it had changed, refined into something quieter, more aware. He replayed the evening not as a performance, but as a lesson, not about her voice, but about his own assumptions. And for the first time in a long time, he did not rush to move past it. He let it stay, across the room. Guests who had once been strangers exchanged conversations that felt more genuine, less rehearsed. A woman who had laughed earlier now spoke softly to a server, thanking her with a sincerity that had not been present before. A man who had been quick to judge now listened more than he spoke, and though no one announced it, the atmosphere had shifted into something quieter, something more grounded, as if the room itself had remembered what it meant to see beyond the surface. Outside, Evelyn reached the corner of the street and paused briefly as the light changed, the red glow reflecting softly against her face. A passing car slowed, then moved on, and in that simple moment, she looked no different from anyone else. Waiting to cross, no sign of the voice that had just filled an entire ballroom, no trace of the presence that had silenced a crowd. And that was the truth they had all missed, that extraordinary does not always arrive dressed for recognition. Sometimes it stands quietly in the corner, waiting not to be seen, but simply to be itself. The light shifted to green, and Evelyn stepped forward, disappearing into the steady movement of the city, leaving behind no announcement, no explanation, only the quiet imprint of what had been revealed. Back inside, Daniel turned away from the window, his gaze moving across the room one last time, not as a host, but as someone who had witnessed something he could not control, and perhaps was never meant to. He exhaled slowly, a small, almost imperceptible release, and in that moment, he understood something simple but lasting, that not every voice asks to be heard, but the ones that do not often carry the most truth, and sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one note, to remind an entire room of what they have been overlooking all along. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.